It is October 31st, 2024, and Zelensky is apparently complaining after one of his reported demands from his so called victory plan was leaked by the New York Times. They revealed that Zelensky was demanding Tomahawk cruise missiles from the US with his latest plan. Not only did Washington not approve of that, but they apparently didn't approve of a number of things on Zelensky's latest NATO wish list. But while all of that is happening, you also have the Pentagon and the new NATO chief suddenly jumping on board with Zelensky's claim that not only are there North Korean troops in Russia, but that they are getting ready to join the front lines, that they are already among Russian troops in the Kursk region where Ukraine has launched this ongoing incursion there. And they're trying to make it into this big story as if it's something that everyone should be aware of and trying to flip the script, right? Acting as though Russia is so desperate when the reality is that Ukraine is incredibly desperate, right? The Kiev regime is desperate for everything from weapons and ammunition to manpower. So, where is all of this headed, especially in the coming weeks and months? Well, we got into all of the latest with a special guest earlier. So, let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is international relations and security analyst Mark Sleboda. Mark, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
Rachel, thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on the show.
Always good to have you. I always enjoy our discussions, and I know that my audience does as well. And I am curious
Hi,
because
audience.
over the right, all the people tuning in, I've even gotten people that will comment on my videos, and they're like, "Where is the new Mark Sleboda video? You need to be talking to him." And I'm like, "We talk pretty regularly, right? We have these discussions at least once a week, but." The people at least make it known what they do like. Now, I'm curious too about your take on this latest kind of unfolding saga because a couple of weeks ago we had Zelensky come out and he's saying there are North Korean troops that could be fighting alongside Russian forces. And then South Korea came out and they were like, yeah, there are North Korean forces that are, already in Russia. They're training by literally over 10,000 of them. But it took NATO and the Pentagon and the US a couple weeks, it seems, to really hop on board. But now they have hopped on board and they're claiming that there are not just North Korean forces in Russia, but they are fighting alongside Russian forces in Russia's Kursk region against Ukrainian forces that have carried out an incursion there. So, what is your take on this whole unfolding saga and how we got to this point and what is actually happening?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of stories out there. I mean, some stories say that there's 1,500 North Korean troops. They're not actually troops. Other stories say there's special forces. Another story they say there's 10,000 North Korean special forces there. And I've seen other stories saying 10,000. There's 100,000, maybe a billion North Korean troops. And Kursk, nothing. They're about to invade Seattle. Wolverines, right? I mean, I've never actually seen the awful remake of that wonderfully awful 1980s flick, but I understand it was made about North Korea because why not? I mean, next, I guess the Houthis will be invading the United States and maybe Kursk too. I guess. So I have to say that I'm extremely skeptical about this story. At least at the beginning, the U.S. and NATO were making very vague, non-committal sounds to this story propagated by the Kiev regime. But they evidently now have sources and information which they don't tell us, and I would not be at all surprised if their only sources of information on this are the Kiev regime itself. There have been similar disinformation coming out of the Pentagon and the NATO Secretary General previously in this conflict. The Russian government has been, well, at least the Russian president has made some extremely, I would consider, coy comments about this, basically saying we're effectively de facto allies with North Korea. We have a strategic partnership with them, mutual defense clause, and what we do with them on our own territory is our own business, and sawed off. I mean, paraphrasing here. We have actually had some, though, denials by the Russian foreign minister Sergei Lavrov and others, and also, for what it's worth, on the North Korean side. Now, I have no doubt that there are North Korean soldiers in Russia. There are, I don't know how many of them there are. Are there 10,000? That seems like a lot, but I have no doubt they're training with Russian soldiers. They're performing military interoperability exercises. And they may have a small number of troops behind Russian lines, logisticians, combat engineers, these sorts of things, who are, maybe I've heard also possibly some drone specialists. They're learning what the Russians are doing, because the Russians are engaged in something that really hasn't been seen since World War II, an actual major conflict with a peer adversary. And, you know, if you want to consider NATO a peer adversary, certainly NATO does not. Russia's a near peer. So I'm going to be equally dismissive and say that NATO is a near peer adversary of Russia's. They're not holding their own very well, but so North Koreans have a lot to learn. And I would not be at all surprised if they're behind the line somewhere, and that this is where this is being blown up into a major propaganda point from. I do not believe that the Russian government will send North Korean troops into Kursk, right, or anywhere else. It must be said, if they did send them into Kursk, that would be Russia's own territory, and that is perfectly internationally legally legitimate, right? However, I don't believe that that's the case, and there are a number of reasons for that. One, Russia has no shortage of manpower, right? It's the Kiev regime has a shortage of manpower. Russia is not sending out press gangs roaming their streets, grabbing people out of gyms and nightclubs and everywhere else, and beating them and dragging them away to the recruitment offices. Russia is signing up volunteer contract soldiers at 30,000 a month, 1,000 a day, for very good pay, it must be said, and a cause that the Russian public generally believes in. So there's, I mean, manpower can't hurt, but the issues that would come with it, the diplomatic issues, the global South would collectively raise an eyebrow, right? If North Korea was participating, and some far more than an eyebrow. And I have to say that I very much doubt that Putin wants any more eyebrow raising by Brazil or India or these other partners of Russia in BRICS and other organizations that have been kind of pushing a peace narrative. The so Diplomatically, I believe it would be a huge mistake, and certainly the Russian government is aware of that. Secondly, Russia has no interoperability at this moment with North Korea, right? They have not been training with North Korean forces at least since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, right? And so probably before that. I don't know exactly when the last time the Soviet Union, but decades ago, right? Meaning there is no interoperability. Generally, Russians don't speak Korean, and Koreans don't speak Russian, right? Or not enough of them, certainly within the military, to make it so. And this is a very complicated war. I mean, there's false, friendly fire incidences on both sides all the time, and that's for people who actually speak the same language and have been practicing together. It would be a military nightmare. It would create more military problems than it would gain benefits by having 1,500 troops or 10,000 troops or a billion troops or whatever the issue is. So I have to say I could be wrong, but I don't believe. I believe that this is a Kiev regime propaganda talking point. They're playing up the fact that simply there are some North Koreans somewhere in the largest country in the world, probably much closer to the Pacific Ocean than the Atlantic, but regardless, and but I don't believe they have anything directly to do with the conflict in Ukraine. This is the Kiev regime, on one hand, pushing again to get NATO troops directly involved. The North Koreans are fighting. You have to join too. They're also using it to argue for long range strikes. Oh, those North Korean troops, they're just out of our range. If only we
Mhm.
had some Tomahawk cruise missiles, we could hit them. They're also pushing for more South Korean involvement, probably not South Korean troops, although evidently South Korea is offering to send some torture experts, interrogators, for the North Korean POWs that are widely expected, at least in the Kiev regime's propaganda circles. But they would like more South Korean artillery shells and military equipment and the like. That's what I think that this is about. I don't think the Kiev regime has a history of denigrating and um, propaganda rhetoric attacking simply Russians of an Asian appearance. And Russia has some over 200 indigenous ethnicities, including people like the Buryat, the Chukchi, and others that, they may not look like North Koreans, but for those of a racist, anti-Asian bent, I'm sure all Asians look alike, because that's what they say anyway. And Russian soldiers from Buryatia in Russian uniform. Oh, it's North Koreans. They must be North Koreans. They don't look white and Aryan,
Mhm.
right? And this has been a part of the
Right.
Kiev regime's propaganda from the beginning of this conflict. It's actually a major feature of Banderite fascist ideology. In fact, going well before Russia's intervention in the conflict, back to the Maidan Putsch itself in 2014, where Russia is depicted as the barbarian Asiatic Mongoloid hordes and the Aryan Slavic Ukrainian Rus will defend Europe from those barbarian Mongoloid Russian Asiatic hordes. That has been a repeated feature of Kiev regime propaganda and their own internal little revolting amount of racism and the like. Hearing them denigrate Russian soldiers of Asian group ethnicity is really not anything new, and it's certainly not surprising. And I think that's more of what is playing into the online propaganda, at least at this point.
Yeah, yeah, it is. It's crazy to see how we've come to this point, and I'm with you. It was interesting how you had Zelensky in this position where he's throwing out these claims, and then the West kind of waits a minute, and then they hop on board with it, and now they're putting these claims out there, and you've got the U.S. talking about, oh, well, the North Koreans would be legitimate targets if they're on the front lines. It's like, oh, wait a second, how
Legitimate
many?
targets for who? Is the
Right.
U.S. involved in this war? They keep saying they're not. I was shocked when the Pentagon said they would be legitimate targets for who?
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Exactly. And the fact that on top of that, how many different mercenaries, foreign fighters, NATO related people are in Ukraine right now, and when Russia talks about legitimate targets for them, then the West wants to act like how dare they say that, right? How dare they? And it's like, well, you're in this position where now all of a sudden you've created they claim that there are North Koreans on the front lines and now you have to target them. And it is just the hypocrisy is truly never ending there. But
Yeah,
speaking
not
of
not just
something,
hypocrisy, but more than likely projection.
yeah. Right. When they talk about Russia being so desperate that they have to send North Koreans to the front lines, it's like, what are you really trying to say here about the position that Kiev is currently in?
Oh,
And
I'm I'm sorry. I just rolled my eyes so hard. I think I cut my eyeball.
exactly. You you think you can't roll your eyes any more than you currently do until you see the position that they keep putting us in. And whenever there are stories like this one about North Korea that are out there and that are dominating the headlines in the Western media, I always go, okay, what do they want us not to talk about, right? What are they trying to cover for here? And we know that, obviously last week there was that major BRIC summit that happened that the West definitely didn't want to talk about. But in addition to that, you also have Zelensky's attempted victory plan tour that hasn't gone so well. And you have the New York Times reporting this week that Kiev had asked the US for Tomahawk cruise missiles in order to strike targets deep inside Russia. And that apparently Zelensky is now expressing frustration with the fact that so-called classified details of his victory plan were leaked to the Western press. He suddenly is not too happy with the Western press. How do you see this situation? What Zelensky may have been demanding, and the fact that this so-called victory plan was literally hyped up by the West to then just fall completely flat, at least so far.
Yeah, it has to be said. The other thing they don't want us to talk about is, of course, what's going on the battlefield, like the complete collapse of Ukrainian forces in South Donbass, right? I mean, they really don't want you paying any attention to that. So that's certainly a part of this North Korean narrative too. So this is interesting. Now, the behind the scenes, right? It's long been discussed on the dream wish list of pro Kiev regime hawks in the Western commentariat. Give them the tomahawks. Give them the tomahawks. Right now, the tomahawks are a strategic strike weapon. Right. First of all, there's again not so many of them. Second of all, the Pentagon does not want to give them out to Ukraine. And third of all, tomahawks can are nuclear capable, like readily nuclear capable, and Russia would just, I mean, that would be World War III right there. There's no question. If a U.S. Tomahawk was fired somewhere into Russia in this conflict, Russia would have an immediate symmetrical response, and somewhere a U.S. military base is going to be hit with a Kinjal or an Onyx or some other hypersonic weapon. There's no doubt there, and where that spiral would take us. So reportedly, I mean, the Pentagon essentially said not only no, but hell no, and ha ha ha. Right? Um, what's interesting, that doesn't surprise me. What does surprise me is the obviously intentional leak of this story. So there's
Mhm.
two different, kind of almost diametrically opposed options here. The one option is this was intentionally leaked as a threat to Russia, right? If you do this, like, I don't know, send the North Korean army into the conflict or something else, we could escalate by giving the Ukrainians the tomahawks that they want. The other hand could be some one in the administration or factions in the administration that are further interested in drawing a remove between the administration and the Zelensky regime, or administration, if you want to call it that, in particular, right? Because it draws a further degree of reality remove away from what the US is capable and willing to provide, and the Death Star and everything else, that and the tomahawks that Zelensky is demanding, right? Because it's always put in those terms, right? Like, as if it's not something optional. So which side does it lie? I can't say that I've gotten a firm signal one way or the other. But the fact that this story was leaked alone is interesting.
Yeah, I'm with you. The fact that all of a sudden is put, and of course, by the New York Times, you always go, okay, that's how you know that the story was leaked, right? That it was intentionally put out there. And now
It could be
go.
worse. It could be Axios. So come on.
Sure. They have, I swear, every time it's Axios with their anonymous officials, and I'm going, okay, do
Who's
they just have
Axios?
a guy or they just have multiple guys that they're relying on and they're, I guess, always on top of it? But going back to what you were saying about what's happening on the battlefield right now, I am curious about the latest on there. I know that there are some reports coming out saying that Kiev is going to try to conscript 160,000 more troops over the next 3 months, not even 3 years, according to statements from lawmakers and media outlets. So, what is the situation like on the battlefield right now? Are the manpower shortages for Kiev getting to the point where they are that bad? And is this all also playing into the current situation with Kiev's incursion into Kursk?
Yeah, the manpower situation is that bad. And I mean, even as this was announced, it was officially acknowledged that the Kiev regime has, at this point, right, mobilized, right, to use that euphemism, more than 1 million troops thus far, and they need 160,000. To which you might raise the question, well, where are the rest of those million troops? Because according to Zelensky, they've only lost 31,000, right? I mean, so somewhere there should be, oh, I don't know, close to 969,000 Ukrainian troops somewhere, but evidently they don't even have enough to man all of their trenches and defensive positions, and their battalions are often at a fraction of the strength that they should be. So evidently their mass forced conscription campaign, because the previous push has never ended. It was just declared, grudgingly admitted now that it was not as successful as it should have been. So now there's a renewed push for another 160,000. And pressure from the West, on both sides in the U.S., on both sides of the political aisle, is increasing for the Kiev regime to lower their conscription age, from further from 25 now to lower to 21 or 18, which of course is a very big hot button issue in Ukraine, where there's this incredible demographic crisis with the narrowing of the population around that age group, because simply Ukrainians haven't had children really in any significant numbers because of the bad economic and political conditions since 91. Which means that if you send hundreds of thousands of that demographic, at least those force them to go to war. The volunteers, of course, of that age group were accepted, but if you conscript a few more 100,000 of that age group, then Ukraine literally won't have a future, right? They will not be able to reproduce enough, and there's 10 million Ukrainians that have left the country since the conflict began. 5 million of them, by the way, in Russia, but another 5 million of them in Europe, and those a lot of those Ukrainians are going to end up with Western men. A lot of the women, more than likely, and the likelihood that they're going to come back to Ukraine and have Ukrainian children. Just saying, it's probably pretty
Yeah.
small. Pretty small. So huge demographic potential crisis there, which is why they've been avoiding it thus far. But the specter has been raised again and again. The West is obviously pushing for it. And Zelensky, the former Kiev regime's top general, now politically exiled as an ambassador to the UK, where he can definitely not speak English if you've seen any
Oh no.
presentations with him. But anyway, he has openly raised again that, yeah, we might have to conscript women. We might have to conscript women into combat positions to protect Europe, of course, from those
Mhm.
Asiatic Mongoloid hordes of Russia. That's literally the way he depicted it. So one of the former Ukrainian presidents has even made public statements about how the population is getting increasingly unhappy with the conscription campaign, with the nature of it, and how it's continuing, and all of the lies and unanswered questions. He said a lot else that, is a lot more complicated, but that was specifically highlighted, so that topic has been breached. And the Kiev regime, for the first time, just brought criminal charges against someone for taping this brutal mass forced conscription, because of course we know that's all just Russian propaganda, right? It's all Russian Hollywood. It's not really happening, except that we're charging people and with potential prison time if they simply record these brutal press gangs. So uh, take that with a grain of salt.
Wow. It is just it's mind-boggling to think about the current situation that we're in, and yet we've been building up to this point and it's just going to keep getting worse, and that's a problem that NATO is going to have to deal with at some point, along with all of the other problems here. Certainly a lot at stake here all around, and I really appreciate you taking the time to join me today to break down all of the latest international relations and security analyst Mark Sleboda. Thanks so much for your time and insight.
Thanks for having me.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment, and as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. That's where you can also find new episodes of my exclusive weekly series for paid subscribers called Sanctioned. You don't want to miss this week's episode. You can also find Sanctioned over on my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Rachel Blevins. That's where you can sign up, participate in regular polls and Q&As, and join the community there. As always, thank y'all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.